Imagine that your entire life depends on the harvest, and most of your time is spent doing exhausting work. Rest? Entertainment? It seems that these words could not have existed in the vocabulary of medieval English peasants. We are used to thinking of the Middle Ages as a dark era full of deprivation and endless labor, where the common people had no time for joy. But what if I told you that this image is far from the truth? What if, even under the harsh feudal system, peasants found ways to relax, have fun, and even let loose? Get ready to dive into an amazing world where seemingly hopeless routine was interrupted by bursts of genuine fun and unexpected celebrations. If you think that the life of a medieval peasant was a series of endless sufferings, this video will change your mind forever. Watch this video to the end, because what you learn will make you look at our ancestors in a completely different light. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories that will change your view of the past. The first thing that comes to mind when we talk about entertainment in the Middle Ages is, of course, religious holidays. The church played a central role in the life of every peasant, determining not only moral norms, but also the rhythm of everyday life. The calendar was literally dotted with all kinds of holy days and church holidays, from Christmas to Easter, from St. Michael's Day to St. John the Baptist's Day. On these days, which numbered more than 100 a year, peasants were strictly forbidden to work. This was a time for going to church, praying and reflecting. But more importantly for the common people, it was a time for socializing and unrestrained merriment. After the obligatory Mass, which often took place in an atmosphere of strict piety, folk festivities began, which were strikingly different from the strict church rituals, sometimes turning into real bacchanalia. Churchyards, which were the only sufficiently spacious and open spaces in most villages, and the surrounding areas were transformed into noisy fairs and centers of attraction for the entire community. The peasants, finally freed from hard labor and the oppression of everyday life, indulged in revelry with frenzied enthusiasm. The main drink was undoubtedly beer, which was brewed in almost every house and drunk in huge quantities. It was not only a way to relax, relieve fatigue, and forget about problems, but also a safe drink, as water was often contaminated and carried the risk of intestinal infections. Beer was low in alcohol, but the amount consumed in a day could easily lead to intoxication. Under the influence of alcohol, morals became looser. People sang folk songs, often of an indecent nature, danced lively folk dances to simple music played on flutes, bagpipes, and drums. Gambling with dice and even improvised theatrical performances mocking vices or recounting everyday situations were also popular. These holidays were the only legal outlet for the peasants. Throughout the year, their lives consisted of monotonous, exhausting labor, submission to the Lord, and a constant struggle for survival. The rare days off were a real gift, and they took full advantage of them. Christmas celebrations, for example, could last up to 12 days, including not only church services, but also mass feasts, gift exchanges, games, and singing. Shrovetide before Lent was a time when everything that was usually forbidden was allowed. Abundant food, loud music, costume parades, and wild revelry. These holidays were so important that even the authorities, aware of their role in maintaining social peace, did not interfere with the peasants' liberties as long as they did not cross certain boundaries. It was a kind of social outlet that allowed people to release pent-up tension and avoid more serious unrest. It is important to note that many of these traditions, although adapted by the church, had their roots in ancient pagan rituals associated with fertility, the changing of the seasons, and the worship of natural forces. Thus, church holidays were a bizarre mixture of Christian rituals and archaic folk beliefs. Despite its strictness, the church was often forced to compromise with folk traditions in order not to alienate its flock. Priests understood that attempts to completely eradicate centuries-old customs could lead to a loss of influence and even open disobedience. Therefore, they preferred to turn a blind eye to worldly entertainment, as long as the peasants regularly attended Mass and paid tithes. Moreover, many church holidays, such as the days of patron saints, became local village festivals, where the church service was only the beginning of noisy feasts and entertainment. Often, the priests themselves participated in these festivities, which brought them closer to the people and strengthened their authority, albeit at the cost of some deviation from strict church canons. It was a kind of deal between the spiritual authorities and the everyday needs of the peasants, allowing a fragile balance to be maintained between religious piety and the need to let off steam. Provocative question: do you think medieval peasants were the epitome of piety? What if I told you that even in those days, churches became arenas for real drunken brawls and fights, and priests often turned a blind eye to this in order not to lose their flock in popularity? If you want to know why even the church couldn't keep peasants from wild entertainment, and how these fun holidays became an integral part of their spiritual life, watch this video to the end. Sports and competitions were an integral part of peasant entertainment, providing an outlet for pent-up energy and aggression. One of the most popular but also most dangerous games was medieval football, or as it was sometimes called, mob football. It was not at all like the game we know today. In medieval football, there were no clear rules. The number of players on each side was unlimited, and the field stretched for several miles between villages. The goal was to kick the ball into the opponent's goal, which could be located in the center of a neighboring village or even on its outskirts. The game often turned into a real mass brawl with punches, kicks, grabs, and the use of improvised weapons, resulting in numerous injuries, fractures, dislocations, deep cuts, and bruises. The chronicles even mention fatalities during such matches, which speaks to the extreme violence and uncompromising nature of these contests. Governments and even the church repeatedly tried to ban the game because of its danger and constant unrest, but to no avail. Nevertheless, this did not stop the peasants, the thrill, the spirit of competition, and the opportunity to release pent-up energy, to measure their strength against their neighbors or even residents of neighboring villages, were stronger than the fear of pain and injury. This game was not only entertainment, but also a kind of baptism of fire for young men, a way to prove their courage, endurance, and strength in the eyes of the community. It served as a kind of battlefield where young people could demonstrate their skills and character. Street football also fulfilled an important social function, uniting the villagers against an external enemy, the team from a neighboring settlement, which strengthened their sense of belonging to their community. In addition to physical strength, cunning and the ability to work as a team were also valued in this game, despite the lack of formal rules. In addition to football, fist fighting and various types of wrestling were also very popular. These fights were not just games, but an opportunity to demonstrate one's strength, agility, endurance, and courage. The winners were held in high esteem in the village and often became local heroes, the pride of their community. These competitions could be organized as impromptu fights or as part of larger celebrations, such as fairs or harvests, and always attracted large crowds of spectators who eagerly cheered on their favorites. The fights could be individual or team events, such as wall-to-wall, where representatives of different villages or different areas of the same village fought each other, sometimes turning into real mass brawls. These games were not only a way to have fun, but also to relieve stress, vent aggression, and strengthen social ties, forming a sense of unity and belonging to a particular group. They were also important social events where young people could show off and girls could evaluate potential suitors based on their physical qualities, strength, and bravery. Provocative question: imagine that your only entertainment is deadly dangerous football, where there are no rules and instead of a stadium, there are endless fields. Why did peasants, who already had enough dangers in their lives, play these risky games with such persistence? If you want to know what drove them to take such risks, and why sport was not just a game for them, but a way to survive and express themselves, watch this video to the end. Long winter evenings when work in the fields came to a standstill, and short summer nights after a tiring day were the perfect time for oral creativity and storytelling. Peasants would gather together, often around a warm fireplace in someone's hut, where it was warm and cozy, or in the summer, under the open sky, under the stars, to tell stories. These could be folktales full of magic, adventure, good and evil forces, where good always triumphed over evil, or legends about local heroes and villains, the exploits of ancestors, the struggle against the injustice of lords, or mysterious events that took place in their village. Particularly popular were very spicy anecdotes and stories that would shock modern audiences with their frankness and directness, mocking sexual taboos and social vices. The humor was often crude but very lively, understandable, and familiar to every peasant, reflecting their everyday concerns and joys. These stories not only entertained, but also served an important function. They passed on knowledge, life experience, moral lessons, and cultural values from the older generation to the younger. Oral storytelling was the primary means of preserving and transmitting historical memory and traditions in a society where the vast majority of the population was illiterate, and books were incredibly rare and luxurious. These were the living, ever-changing textbooks and entertainment shows of the Middle Ages. Music and dance were an integral part of any holiday and even everyday life. Peasants played the simplest instruments, often made by their own hands. Wooden flutes, pipes, bagpipes, primitive drums made from animal skins, and sometimes even lutes if there was someone in the village who owned such an instrument, or if it was brought by a traveling musician. The dances were simple but very energetic, rhythmic, and lively, often performed in a circle or chain. They were not only a way to have fun and entertain oneself after a hard day's work, but also an important element of socialization, especially for young people who could meet and spend time together, choosing a partner. For everyone, it was a way to strengthen their sense of community, unity, and belonging to the village, creating a collective experience of joy and solidarity. Music accompanied not only holidays and celebrations, but also everyday life. For example, while working in the fields, spinning, or at the loom, it made hard physical labor easier by creating a certain rhythm and mood, helping to cope with monotony and fatigue. Songs could be lyrical, dedicated to love and nature, or satirical, mocking lords, priests, or negligent neighbors, serving as a kind of outlet for expressing discontent and a way to criticize the authorities without risking direct confrontation. Folklore was a living, constantly evolving system that reflected all aspects of peasant life. Fairs and festivals were among the most anticipated and significant events in the lives of medieval peasants, real bright spots in their monotonous existence. These were not just places for trade, but also major entertainment centers where people from all over the area flocked. Fairs were held several times a year in large cities or towns, and were a real event that people prepared for in advance. Here you could not only sell surplus crops, livestock, or handicrafts, but also buy necessary goods that were not available in the village itself: tools, fabrics, salt, and spices. And the atmosphere at the fairs was festive and noisy. Merchants bustled everywhere. Barkers shouted and music played. Street performers entertained the crowds at the fairs. Acrobats demonstrating incredible agility and strength. Magicians astonishing the imagination with simple but amazing tricks. Jugglers deftly manipulating objects, and musicians playing a wide variety of instruments. These performances attracted crowds of onlookers, becoming the main entertainment for many. In addition, gambling, such as dice and the simplest forms of lotteries, flourished at fairs. Peasants, despite their poverty and desire to save money, were not averse to risking a small amount in the hope of striking it rich. It was a way not only to have fun and experience thrills, but also to get a chance at instant wealth, albeit meager, which was very tempting in conditions of constant need. Fairs were a place where you could forget your everyday worries, feel part of the big world, and immerse yourself in an atmosphere of celebration, noise, excitement, and abundance that was so different from your everyday life. Fair days began early in the morning. At dawn, endless lines of carts loaded with goods and peasants carrying their own produce stretched along the roads leading to the fairgrounds. The air was filled with anticipation and the hum of voices. Merchants from distant cities set up their tents and laid out goods that were exotic to the rural inhabitants. Fine cloth, bright dyes, exotic spices, and elegant jewelry. Each item was not just a thing, but a story brought from distant lands, evoking wonder and admiration. Seeing such diversity, the peasants felt part of a big world that seemed so distant and inaccessible in their everyday lives. Spectacles occupied a special place at fairs. In addition to the aforementioned traveling artists, fistfights, wrestling competitions, and sometimes more brutal entertainment, such as animal baiting, were often held. Despite their harshness, these spectacles attracted many spectators thirsty for thrills. For peasants whose lives were filled with monotonous labor and deprivation, such spectacles were an outlet for pent-up emotions, an opportunity to feel alive, even if only for a short time. They watched with rapt attention every movement of the wrestlers, every blow, experiencing all the twists and turns of the fight along with the participants. The social function of fairs was no less important. It was a place where people met relatives and friends from neighboring villages, exchanged news, arranged marriages, and settled disputes. Here you could learn about events in the world, crop prices in other regions, and political news that, in one way or another, affected their lives. The fair was a kind of information center where all available information flowed. Communication was as valuable as trade. Peasants felt part of a large community where everyone knew each other and where they could get support or advice. This gave them a sense of security and belonging, which was especially important in the harsh medieval world. Fairs were also a place where financial matters could be settled. Deals were made, debts were paid, and currencies were exchanged, especially at large fairs that attracted merchants from different countries. It was a kind of medieval stock exchange where prices for basic goods were determined and where buyers and sellers could be found for any product. Peasants sold their crops and received cash, which they then spent on necessary purchases or saved for the future. For many, this was their only source of income apart from subsistence farming. The ability to bargain and get the best price was an important skill that was passed down from generation to generation. A culture of feasting and merriment also flourished at fairs. After the main trading was over, especially in the evening, taverns and inns opened, offering food and drink. People gathered around tables, drank beer and ale, ate simple but hearty food, sang songs, and danced. It was a rare chance to completely relax and forget about hard work. The festive atmosphere promoted unity, broke down social barriers, and allowed peasants, if only for a short time, to feel free from their daily duties and hardships. These moments of joy and carefreeness were invaluable to them, giving them strength to continue their struggle for survival. Lotteries and games, which were often primitive but promised instant riches, were particularly exciting. Examples include the Wheel of Fortune and simple fortune-telling. Peasants, despite their practicality, were not averse to hoping for luck. These games were not just entertainment for them, but a kind of miracle, an opportunity to change their lives, albeit a small one, but still an opportunity. They saw it as a chance to escape poverty, acquire what they had long dreamed of, or simply feel lucky. This excitement, this hope for a miracle, was one of the powerful incentives that attracted them to fairground entertainment. Fairs also contributed to the development of crafts. Next to the merchants selling agricultural products were blacksmiths, potters, weavers, and shoemakers. They demonstrated their wares, took orders, and exchanged experiences. Peasants could order new tools, repair old ones, and purchase necessary household items that they could not produce themselves. This was an important element of economic life, which allowed peasants to improve their working and living conditions. Craftsmen, in turn, gained access to a wide customer base and the opportunity to sell their products. Despite their isolation from the big world and lack of access to written sources, peasants were not completely cut off from cultural trends. They loved listening to stories about wandering knights, heroic deeds, distant lands, and amazing creatures. These stories were brought to them by wandering monks traveling from monastery to monastery, pilgrims returning from holy places, soldiers demobilized after wars, and merchants transporting goods between towns and villages. For many peasants, this was their only source of information about the outside world. And they listened to these stories with bated breath, imagining unknown lands and incredible adventures. Often the merchants themselves, traveling from one village to another, told stories to attract buyers and entertain them, creating a kind of show. These stories were filled with vivid details, exotic descriptions of distant lands, mysterious monsters, or the exploits of legendary heroes. They could be true, exaggerated, or completely fictional, but it didn't matter. Peasants gathered around them, listening with open mouths, and for many the story itself was no less valuable than the goods offered by the merchant. It was a kind of live television or radio that brightened up monotonous everyday life and broadened their horizons, giving them food for imagination and discussion. The travelers' stories also served as a source of inspiration for local fairy tales and legends, enriching the local folklore. In addition to chivalric romances, tales of saints, martyrs, and miracles that took place in monasteries and holy places were very popular. Monks preaching in villages recounted these events, strengthening the faith of the peasants and giving them hope for divine help. These stories were often intertwined with local legends and superstitions, creating a unique blend of folk culture and Christian dogma. They explained to the peasants the structure of the world and man's place in it, and also answered questions about the meaning of life and death. Stories about distant countries and exotic peoples were also extremely fascinating. Merchants and pilgrims who had visited unknown lands shared their impressions, describing strange customs, amazing animals, and unseen plants. These stories broadened the geographical horizons of peasants who rarely left their villages. They allowed them to travel in their minds, imagine themselves in these distant lands, and experience new emotions without leaving their homes. Sometimes these stories were greatly distorted, filled with myths and fantasies, but this only added to their appeal. These oral traditions were also a means of preserving and transmitting historical knowledge, albeit in a highly distorted form. Stories about great battles, kings, and significant events of the past were passed down from mouth to mouth, forming a kind of folk history. Of course, these stories were often more like legends, but they preserved the memory of events and heroes that were important to the people. Through them, peasants felt a connection to the past, to their ancestors, and to the great deeds that had been accomplished before them. An important part of these stories were songs and ballads, which were passed down by traveling minstrels and wandering singers. These songs were a kind of news of the time, telling of recent events, the exploits of heroes, unhappy love, or funny stories. Peasants learned these songs and sang them while working or resting, enriching their leisure time and sharing them with each other. Songs and ballads were not only entertainment, but also a form of self-expression, a way to experience emotions and convey them to others. Thus, despite its apparent simplicity and isolation, the world of medieval peasants was filled with a rich oral culture. Stories about heroes, miracles, and distant lands not only brightened their everyday lives, but also shaped their worldview, passed on values and knowledge, and served as a source of inspiration and hope. These stories were vital for survival in the harsh reality, giving them strength and faith in a better future. Despite the hard work and monotony, collective work in the village often became an occasion for socializing and even fun, strengthening community ties. Sowing, reaping, harvesting, building or repairing a communal mill, constructing a new bridge or road, all this was done together by the entire community. During such collective work, people sang songs, joked, exchanged news, shared gossip, and gave advice. This created a sense of unity and cohesion. After completing a large amount of work, especially after the harvest, collective feasts were often held, which could last until late at night. They shared food that they had obtained or grown, and of course beer, celebrating the completion of a common task and thanking each other for their help. The tradition of mutual assistance, for example, helping a neighbor plow a field, build a new barn, or harvest crops if he was sick or his family was small, was also a reason for the whole community or part of it to gather. Such events were accompanied by a friendly atmosphere, jokes, and of course, a shared meal. This strengthened community ties, fostered a sense of mutual responsibility, and provided an opportunity to take a break from solitary labor and enjoy each other's company. Such events were extremely important for survival in the harsh conditions of the Middle Ages, but they also served a social function, allowing people to get to know each other better, resolve conflicts, and simply have a good time. This shows that even in difficult conditions, peasants found ways to turn routine into an opportunity for communication, joy, and strengthening social capital. Community work was not just a duty, but an important part of life. For example, when it was time to sow, the whole village would go out to the fields. The men plowed the land, the women sowed the seeds, and the children helped gather stones. During this process, people constantly communicated, shared experiences, and told stories. It was not just work, but a ritual that brought people together and gave them a sense of common purpose. After a hard day, tired but satisfied, they would gather together to have dinner, discuss plans for the next day, and simply enjoy each other's company. A similar situation arose during the harvest. This period was particularly intense, as the entire year's food supply depended on it. However, despite their fatigue, people found the strength to joke, sing, and compete. Who could gather the harvest fastest? Who could tie the sheaves best? Such small competitions added an element of play to the hard work. In the evening after sunset, bonfires were lit in the fields and people gathered around them to celebrate the completion of an important stage. It was a real harvest festival, accompanied by dancing, singing, and abundant feasts. The construction or repair of common structures such as mills, bridges, or roads also required collective effort. These were large-scale projects that could take several days or even weeks. During such work, people often lived near the construction site, sharing food and shelter. This created a special atmosphere of camaraderie and mutual assistance. Everyone contributed, feeling part of a larger endeavor. Upon completion of the project, when everyone saw the results of their joint efforts, it evoked a sense of pride and satisfaction. In addition to large community projects, there was a tradition of toluk or pomuk, when the entire village would gather to help a neighbor in need. For example, if someone's house burned down, the entire community would come to help rebuild it. Or if a family was too small to handle the harvest, neighbors would come to help. Such events were filled not only with hard work, but also with sincere kindness and compassion. It was an opportunity for people to show their care for their neighbors, strengthen social ties, and show that no one would be left alone in trouble. After the work was done, the host would set a lavish table for their helpers, where everyone would eat, drink, and have fun together. Village meetings, although formal in nature, were also an important part of social life. They discussed important issues affecting the entire community: land distribution, conflict resolution, and the election of the village head. Although these meetings could be heated and contentious, they gave everyone a chance to express their opinion and feel involved in the decision-making process. After the official part was over, people often stayed to socialize, exchange news, and simply spend time together. Thus, collective labor in a medieval village was not just a duty, but an important element of social life. It strengthened community ties, fostered a sense of mutual responsibility, and gave people the opportunity to socialize, have fun, and feel part of a larger whole. These moments were especially valuable in the harsh conditions of peasant life, allowing them to find joy and support within their community. In addition to tales of knightly exploits, peasants listened with great interest to the stories of travelers, pilgrims, and wandering merchants. These people were the newspapers and radio of the Middle Ages, bringing news from distant cities about wars, kings, new goods, and strange places. For peasants who rarely left their villages and lived in a relative information vacuum, this was the only way to learn about what was happening outside their small world. Any news, even the most insignificant, was received with great attention and discussed for many days. Often, the merchants themselves, traveling from one village to another, told stories to attract buyers and entertain them, creating a kind of show. These stories were filled with vivid details, exotic descriptions of distant lands, mysterious monsters, or the exploits of legendary heroes. They could be true, exaggerated, or completely fictional, but it didn't matter. Peasants gathered around them, listening with open mouths, and for many the story itself was no less valuable than the goods offered by the merchant. It was a kind of live television or radio that brightened up monotonous everyday life and broadened their horizons, giving them food for imagination and discussion. The stories of travelers also served as a source of inspiration for local fairy tales and legends, enriching local folklore. What if I told you that traveling merchants were not just salesmen, but true influencers of the Middle Ages who shaped the worldview of peasants? Why were their stories sometimes more important than the goods they brought? If you want to find out how these people, like mobile libraries, broke through the information blockade of the medieval village and why their arrival was a real event, watch this video to the end. Unfortunately, not all entertainment for medieval peasants was peaceful and harmless. Cockfighting was quite a popular spectacle, especially among men, despite its cruelty. These were gambling contests where you could bet on the winner and try your luck. Fortunately, this practice was not widespread and was strongly condemned by the church, although it continued to exist underground. In addition to cockfighting, bear or bull baiting was sometimes practiced, in which animals were chained to a post and dogs were set upon them. These spectacles were extremely cruel and often ended in the death of the animals. However, they attracted large crowds and aroused strong emotions, serving as a form of mass entertainment, albeit highly questionable from a modern perspective. Hunting large game, deer, wild boar, was strictly regulated and was a privilege of the nobility, and poaching was severely punished, even with death. However, peasants were allowed to hunt small game such as hares, foxes, badgers, and various species of birds for food, as well as fish in rivers and ponds, unless prohibited by their lord. This was not so much entertainment as a means of obtaining essential food and diversifying their meager diet. Nevertheless, the pursuit of prey, the use of traps, snares, and tackle, as well as competition for the best catch or the largest game, also had an element of excitement and competition, especially when hunting in groups. This required a certain amount of skill, knowledge of animal habits, and tracking skills, which could also be considered a kind of game with nature. Harvest festivals were perhaps the most significant and lavish events in the life of peasants, marking the culmination of their annual cycle. After the exhausting summer and autumn, when the harvest was gathered and the grain was sent to storage, it was time to celebrate. It was a moment of great relief and deep gratitude for the abundance and the opportunity to survive the coming winter. People gathered together to celebrate the end of the agricultural year, which provided them with food for the entire following year. These celebrations could last for several days, accompanied by ceremonies and rituals designed to ensure the fertility of the land for the coming year. At these celebrations, tables were laden with food, the very harvest for which they had worked so hard, and of course, beer. People sang songs, danced until they dropped, and played different games and competitions to show off their strength and agility. It was the highlight of the year when farmers could really relax, forget their worries, and enjoy the fruits of their labor to the fullest. Such holidays were not only an opportunity to have fun, but also an important element of the agrarian cult, a kind of ritual of thanksgiving to the earth and the higher powers for the harvest. They also strengthened community ties, as all members of the village participated in their preparation and conduct, demonstrating unity and solidarity. Peasants living in close contact with nature were very superstitious. Their world was full of mysteries and inexplicable phenomena, which they explained by the actions of supernatural forces. They believed in fairies, goblins, evil spirits, wood goblins, house spirits, and other mythical creatures that, in their opinion, inhabited forests, rivers, swamps, and even their own homes. Stories about them, often quite gruesome and frightening, were passed down by word of mouth and were part of everyday folklore. These tales, despite their frightening nature, were a form of entertainment, especially on long, dark winter evenings when people gathered around the fireplace. They stirred the imagination, evoked strong emotions, and allowed people to forget their real-life difficulties for a while, immersing themselves in a world of fantasy and mysticism. Belief in magic and the superstition was deeply rooted in the minds of peasants, blending with Christian beliefs. They used various spells, amulets, and rituals to protect themselves from evil, ward off disease, attract good luck, ensure a good harvest, or heal ailments. Although this was not entertainment in the pure sense, the very process of performing these rituals, the belief in their power, and the exchange of knowledge about them were an important part of their cultural life and a source of emotional experiences. Witchcraft and magic could be both a source of fear and a subject of ridicule in village stories, where evil forces were fooled or outwitted. Thus, even fear and superstition became part of their entertainment culture, adding an element of mystery and excitement to life. Do you think these superstitions could have been more than just naive beliefs, but a way to control fear in a world full of uncertainty and danger? And why were these scary stories and rituals as important for entertainment as songs and dances? If you want to learn how medieval peasants used mysticism for survival and fun, watch this video to the end. As you can see, the life of medieval English peasants was much more diverse and eventful than it seems at first glance. Despite hard work, low social status, and constant challenges, hunger, disease, war, and the whims of the lords, they found many ways to entertain themselves and find joy. Religious holidays, folk festivals, sports competitions, songs, dances, fascinating stories, and community gatherings all helped them cope with difficulties, strengthen social ties, maintain mental health, and stay optimistic about life. These people were true masters at finding joy in the little things, turning everyday events and rare breaks from work into occasions for fun and celebration. Their entertainment was closely linked to their way of life, beliefs, and culture, reflecting the spirit of the times and the unique character of the English countryside. They did not just survive, but lived full lives, filled with their own joys, sorrows, and celebrations. Their ability to find light and fun even in the darkest times is an inspiring example of the resilience of the human spirit, which always seeks happiness, joy, and connection. I hope this video has changed your perception of medieval peasants and shown that they were not just a faceless mass, but living, feeling people capable of enjoying life even in the harshest conditions. If you enjoyed this dive into history, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and, of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new exciting discoveries. See you in the next episodes.